Treatable. Really, it's treatable. Yes, it's treatable. It's the Treatable Podcast. Say what's on your mind. It's the Treatable Podcast. Real, coming, treatable. It's the Treatable Podcast. It's all on the Treatable Podcast.
When it comes to addiction recovery, there are many routes you can take. Some people find sobriety in 12-step programs, while others prefer outpatient programming. Some people even carve their own path to sobriety using tools that they just find along the way. But everyone in recovery will tell you the journey to sobriety is rarely a straight line. Welcome to the Treatable Podcast with me, your host, Clint Malley. Today we're talking about addiction recovery through the lens of the book Man Up, Sober Up. If you've got substance use in your background or know somebody who's struggling with an active addiction, you'll want to stick around for this one. And who better to join us for this conversation than the author himself, Ryan Penley. With more than 4 years of hard-won sobriety, Ryan has transformed his life and his adversities into valuable lessons for those still struggling with addiction. Ryan's debut book serves as a practical guide for those seeking to reclaim control over their lives. So today, we're unpacking a few of the book's powerful steps to reclaim respect, conquer isolation, and thrive in recovery.
Treatable Podcast. It's all on the Treatable Podcast.
Ryan, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Yeah. Hey, Clint, I am super pumped to be here. It's an honor, my friend. Truly.
So we're going to unpack your book. I want you to paint a picture for us. Tell me about the turning point that lets you know it's time to make a change. Where were you? How were you feeling? What was going on in your life?
So that's the most common question. Also, one of the most difficult for me to answer because it doesn't work like a bing. You know, I didn't bounce right back out of it. And there's several moments in my life that people assume, you know, I was in a coma, a diabetic coma that kind of created diabetes in my body with drug use. Kind of a wild way to really develop a disease like that. But people think, oh, well, that was it. I'm like, oh, no, I still took a few more years of hitting the bottle and pills and things. And then, you know, I'll share a story that my mother sent me to jail and accused me of trying to murder her. And people say, oh, well, that's it, right? That's the moment. I'm like, no, I limped along a little bit further. So I could say this. I started getting sent to this, in Florida, it's called a Baker Act. And so if you can be considered a harm to yourself or others, they put you under a hold, 72-hour hold. And so I would get put into this 72-hour hold. And this happened like, I don't know, I want to say between 12 and 15 times. But each time I went to this damn thing, it's like 72 hours, I'd get like just a hint of clarity. But it took that many times before it was like I got out of that damn thing for the last time and I said, I'm drawing a line in the sand. And so I think I wouldn't call it a moment, right? If it happened that many times in a row, it was the solidification of my decision was growing stronger. And so I was officially fed up, that's for certain. I was fed up and I wanted to change. I knew I had to change. That was very clear. However, I didn't have all the pieces, right? And I think everybody that's familiar with rock bottom, all the pieces they need are completely unique to them. And so I would say that, you know, that last time I got out of, there was a Baker Act and I got out and I put together a plan and I started implementing accountability and all types of different pieces to the puzzle that I needed to make it happen and stick, right? So I don't have an answer for a very specific moment in time. But yeah, it was almost a slow crawl at first, but I ended up getting momentum.
I think there's something worth unpacking even in that is that we always do feel like there has to be this linear path between being in active addiction and being sober. But really, it's not that way. This process for many people is gradual and it's like breaking down a wall sometimes. And maybe you can see a little bit clearer than you could the time before, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everything is different, right? Even profound, dramatic, really impactful experiences that might change your perspective don't mean that you're going to be sober. There's plenty of people who have had the loss of a loved one or have undergone divorce or lost their job, and they've continued to use. And it's sometimes in the accumulation of a lot of small things. And even when you've been sober, relapse is like a part of many people's recovery story. But all those sober days, they still count, right? Like those don't get taken away. And so it sounds like one of the things you're saying is, hey, my story wasn't a linear story of I was in addiction and then immediately saw the light from heaven and then changed my life. It was something that took a lot of time and it was an evolving process, and it's not as straightforward as that. Is that right?
Oh, you nailed it. I love the word that you chose, is accumulation, right? Because accumulation is like, even though I hadn't become sober, I was putting the pieces, I was figuring a little bit out with each attempt. And so then when you make moves towards anything, whether it's addiction, sobriety, or just a goal, you start to make moves and you start to put some things together mentally, maybe physically, maybe resources, and everything moves and changes on you. So I think that for me in my journey is that each attempt, whether somebody might call it a loss, I like to call them lessons, right? But each attempt, there was something gathered. Now, looking from the outside in, it probably didn't look that way. In fact, I know it didn't look that way according to my friends and family. They didn't see the pieces being put together, but why would they? It ultimately falls on me to put those pieces together, right? And nobody else can really accomplish that.
Yeah, so everybody's story is different. No one way is going to work for everybody, but I think it's silly to not look at other people's stories and figure out if there's some information or some perspective that can be gleaned from it, right? I think it was Emerson who said, every man is my master in some respect, right? Meaning that no matter who you are, how successful you are, there's something that you can learn from somebody. They're going to be better at something than you. And I think it's helpful to think about your steps. Let's unpack your 8 steps that you kind of talk about in your book that helped you to now live a life where you're happy, where you feel fulfilled, where you actually have a purpose and you feel like you're really inspiring people and making a difference. So where would this first step start for us?
Well, the first step, I think, is always honesty, developing it with yourself first. And so I think that initially, when you first start, you have to run some real truth across your own life, your own lifestyle. And this can apply to people at all stages of recovery. And when you become honest with yourself and you're able to gain some objectivity of where you're at, and I've developed a framework since I've written the book, I call it OCD, right? And that's just to make it stick a little bit firmer in the mind, is that the first part of OCD is objective observation. You need a little bit of space from yourself to gain some truth about where you're at. If you're not honest, it's highly unlikely that you get very far, because you're unable to make moves because you're too far off base about where you need to begin. And so the next part of the OCD is the correction of what you observe. So once you gain objectivity of your observation of yourself, then you're able to make an accurate correction of what needs to happen. And the D is you have to do it, right? Like you have to apply the difference in your life, right? You have to do something differently. And then that final part there, when you apply that, that's when things really start to become different. You start to change your identity and things of that nature. But yeah, I am a firm believer that if you can get a little bit of space. So for instance, back when I was saying that I was Baker acted that many times, the 72 hours wasn't what most would consider the length of a rehab or something of that nature, right? Because, typically people, they want to call it at least 21 days to start a new habit. You hear all these different time frames, but each time I gained just a hint of objectivity. I got just enough clarity to put something together that I could maybe walk away with, whether I knew it or not. That 72 hours was getting me just the tiniest bit of objectivity, but in time and over enough repetitions, I managed to put it together and make some serious differences in my life.
I was going to ask, what was your drug of choice?
So I had always recreationally partied, and this included cocaine, pills, opiates, always alcohol, any real assorted drugs. But I would say the real addiction, the turning point was pills, because I had an injury and a doctor had prescribed me enough to kill a rhinoceros. Now, I don't put responsibility on that doctor, even though some people might say that I could. I don't, because I still put them in my mouth and I still put them into my body. But people closest to me will say that that was like a real turning point, and that's when things got nasty. And then when I couldn't get pills anymore, and people that are familiar with opiates, they know that, like, pills are like the finest form of heroin that exists. This is why many people addicted to pills turn to heroin. I had still kind of recreationally did drugs still. I couldn't afford them. And then it was alcohol, because for like $6, you could get like a liter of some really nasty gut rot kind of alcohol. And that's what I limped along with there for a few years, because I lacked the resources to really get any decent drugs, right? So it was, if I had to put two down on the list here, it'd be 1, opiates, and then 2, alcohol.
This episode of Treatable is brought to you by Sandstone Care, which helps teens, young adults, and their families overcome challenges with mental health, substance use, and addiction. They provide age-specific, individualized treatment plans centered around your unique situation and goals, and they only use evidence-based therapies to help you get there. They keep their group therapy sizes small so folks can connect with others going through the same struggle, and so that you never feel alone. They also give academic and vocational support to help you improve your grades or to get started on your career path. And lastly, because they know that mental health and substance use affect the people closest to us, they provide support for the whole family through their family therapy program. To learn more about teen and young adult treatment options, go to sandstonecare.com. Change is possible, and Sandstone Care is here to help. Can I just ask, just because you talked about the Baker Act, and for listeners who may not be familiar with it, the Baker Act refers to the Florida Mental Health Act. This allows people to be taken into a hospital and then held there for a temporary detention for 72 hours for a mental health examination. But 72 hours is roughly 3 days, right? And with withdrawal from alcohol or opioids or benzodiazepines, also known as benzos, that can be fatal, right? If you don't withdraw correctly. So how did they manage withdrawal for you?
Great question. Part of the perpetuation of my alcoholism, I was afraid to go through the withdrawals because I had experienced seizures. I was aware that the alcohol withdrawals could kill me. And there's very few drugs like cocaine. If you quit doing cocaine and you go through withdrawals, it can't kill you. Opioid withdrawals, they suck. They're horrible. You might want to die, but you don't die. And alcohol is one of the few. It will kill you if done abruptly, especially with the volumes that I was doing. I was drinking a liter of vodka a day. That much volume of alcohol going into your body, and then you quit it. And so when I first experienced that, you're right about that time frame, that 72 hours, because I had been sober for like a couple of days, and it was hard. I was shaking, I was sweating, I was going through all of it, but I thought I was doing the noble thing. I thought I was making progress, and I'm like, I'm going to get through it. I'm going to get through it. I'm going to white knuckle this thing. And now this is not a Baker Act. This situation is at home. And I went into a seizure, and my foot got stuck under like a dresser, and I broke my foot. I woke up, I was covered in urine, and I was surrounded by firefighters. And I looked around and I said, I don't know what happened. And they said, well, you were seizing. And then they said, you're an alcoholic. And I said, yes, I am. And they said, well, how long has it been since you drank? And I said, about 2 days. And they did not look surprised at all. They're like, yep, that makes sense. And so your question is how did they deal with these withdrawals in the Baker Act? Now, the Baker Act, when they like detain you, you're in a hospital. And so I kind of knew they wouldn't let me die. And so that helped. As I had gone through it so many times, I had decided that it was going to be my launch pad. I knew if I could stay through the 72 hours, my chances of staying sober would be the highest at that point. they would release me, and then I would try to use it to be my launch pad. And so that was kind of the plan. But what you're saying is 100% real. And I used that fear and also the explanation to perpetuate the alcoholism.
So 2 things that stood out to me from just even this first step is, one, you talk about honesty being the first step, and you have your method, this OCD method, which is observation, correction, and then D as in do it, OCD. The first thing is that it reminds me a little bit of a therapeutic technique called motivational interviewing, in which a therapist first identifies the goals that somebody has. What are your goals? Are you happy? Are you living the life you want to live? And generally, if you're in a therapy session, there's probably at least something that you're not happy about that you want to be better, right? And so you identify goals. And then the second step is to say, what is your current situation? Juxtaposing your goals with your current situation and your current actions, routines, behaviors, so that you at least have an understanding that there's a discrepancy, right? Hey, I want to be a good father or mother or friend. I want to get promoted at my job. I want to start working out. That might be my goals. My current actions are that I'm drinking all the time, or that I'm staying up late and I'm not getting enough sleep, or that I'm actually avoiding my family because I'm afraid they're going to see me when I'm like this, right? And when you're able to go between those 2 things, it at least allows you to be able to be honest with yourself and be like, okay, things aren't exactly the way I want them to be. There's some stuff I need to change. And then the second thing from your story that really stood out to me is the biological component when it comes to addiction and clarity, right? At some point, in order for somebody to have that kind of honest assessment with their life, they need to be biologically free from a substance for some amount of time to have a moment of clarity. If I'm not able to sit in a group therapy chair or a therapy chair or to have a clear mind, or if I'm only thinking about using again and I'm in active withdrawal, then it is going to be really hard for me to do that inventory I talked about earlier, where I'm thinking about my goals and my current situation. That clarity is not going to come. And so if you or someone you know is in that situation, this makes a lot of sense. You've got to be in a state where you can at least have some time where you don't have substances within your system. And then once you're there, let's take your goals, let's take your current situation, and let's be honest about them and compare the 2 and see where the discrepancy is. Anything you want to add to that?
Oh, man. Yeah. Because I'm somewhat familiar with the motivational interviewing. That makes sense to kind of link it up with my framework there. But then you start talking about goals, right? Because the first step is to know that there's a discrepancy. There's a gap here. But then the next big question is always, well, what do I do? Like, what do I do to get there? And depending on where you're at in a process, and this is part of my steps here, is that like the appropriate embrace of the right kind of challenge is so important. If you think too big, you get anxious, and it's too large. So an example of this would be like, okay, I need to get sober. So here I go. I'm going for a year. That's too much. Like, it's too much. Why they say one day at a time for a reason. And what that is kind of like the catchphrase of shrinking down a large goal that's filled with way too much anxiety. And then you eventually say, well, there's no way I'm going to do it. And then you give up, right? And then you could get what you call a loss. I call a lesson. And so now embracing the ideal challenge, if you think about it, maybe not the sobriety thing, because oftentimes you got to start super duper small when it comes to addiction and recovery. You got to start very small. But say for your average kind of a goal, especially what you're talking about, motivational interviewing, and somebody has a goal out there and they go too small. So there's a spectrum of very large goals and smaller goals. If you lean too small on that spectrum, what do you get then? You become bored. You're not excited. You don't gain any real intrinsic value from the accomplishment. And so it doesn't really put any fuel on the fire. And so then, what I really like to get into is finding and embracing the ideal challenge for you, the unique challenge that you need to begin with, right? And everybody's goals are different. Right? And then also their first steps would be different because we all come to the table with our own different set of resources and experiences and gifts and blessings and all of that. So where we begin will always be different from somebody else's starting point. But that discrepancy between where you want to be and then where you're at is so key. And to touch on what you're saying about gaining just enough clarity or having the lack of substances in your body, it makes me think back to I was diagnosed with so many inaccurate diagnoses because I was showing up to a doctor and I was drunk or I was high. And so here's this poor doctor trying to effectively treat me. And so I got diagnosed with schizophrenia. I got diagnosed with depression and bipolar. And so like looking back, was there, I feel like their effort was there, but how can you effectively either make decisions as the person who is the addict or alcoholic or the person trying to treat that person when the substances are still in the body, in the system, or still clouding the mind? And so it's so imperative. And really that's like the toughest part for many times, because you're right. If somebody's sitting there and they're willing to go through treatment, but they're going through withdrawals, the likelihood that they're receiving any real message or doing any own work in their mind is very small. They're only thinking about one thing, right? That's a very tough process.
Really cool concept when you think about goals on the spectrum and finding the sweet spot between something that's challenging enough and also not going to be overwhelming to do, right? So if my goal is, well, I'm just not going to drink any dark liquor, maybe not a challenging enough goal for you, right? But to say I'm going to be sober for the rest of my life and I'm never going to drink again, that also might be too much, right? So we have to find that balance. And to your point, that's going to be unique for everybody. And I think most goals are like that. And when we get motivated, we want to make big goals. And we feel like if we make bigger goals, then somehow it'll make it stick more. And we see this evidence with New Year's resolutions that usually those big goals are not the things that work. I think about this sometimes as I get older and I go to the gym, and going to the gym is different as you get older compared to when you're younger. And so I've had to set different goals for myself in the regards that sometimes just showing up is a win. Sometimes it's a binary thing. It's either an A or a B. Did I show up? If I did, then I won, right? And it can be even the same way when it comes to addiction recovery. Did I not drink today? Yes, then I won, right? Did I not use today? Yes, then I won. So those smaller goals are a great tip. The other thing I want to talk about real quickly was medication-assisted treatment. So for our listeners or watchers who are seeing this and they're saying, I am terrified of withdrawal, medication-assisted treatment can actually be a really useful tool. Some people in the addiction recovery space are really against it, but let me just throw some stuff at you real quick. You can look this up. You can Google it later. There's a lot of different types of medication-assisted treatments that you can do that can help to negate the biological symptoms of using and also negate the pleasure that comes if you do use, right? So you've got things like Withdrawal, you've got things like Suboxone, and essentially what these things do is they do not allow you to get the same pleasure that you would get if you use. So they attach to a receptor, they block that receptor. It's a similar way that when you drink coffee, it blocks the adenosine receptor and doesn't allow you to feel tired. It can block that pleasure receptor. So those medication-assisted treatments, especially for people in early recovery, for some people, can be really helpful for people just being able to sit in the chair and sit with themselves. So if that's you and you're like, I can't do this on my own, if you find a treatment center, and there's plenty of treatment centers, look up MAT, medication-assisted treatment. That can be a helpful way to get this biological component that Ryan's talking about. I wanted to ask you a follow-up question, Ryan, because you talked about how when you went to the doctor, they were giving you all of these diagnoses that, schizophrenia, whatever, that are often applied to mental health conditions, but really it was just because you were, intoxicated or you're drunk or whatever. Did you ever come to a point to where you realized that there was like an underlying mental health challenge that wasn't addressed, that was kind of the source of you using, or was it something else altogether?
I can say that, well, I guess we'll just catch up the story here, that eventually I got off of all of my medications. And I was on naltrexone, which was like what you were just mentioning, it's a blocker for opioids and in alcohol. It, just like Clint was saying, it prevented it from working. And so anyways, I have now, I take no mental health medicines, but I like to emphasize that when you're in the trenches, it's so hard to know up from down. And I didn't. And so like looking back, there was times when I had tried to maybe do the math, like, well, where did it come from? Like, what exact trauma can I nail this down with? And that never happened. Like I'm kind of forward thinking, future oriented. And so I never, and people will have really given me a hard time about this. They're like, you need to fix your traumas. And when I sit down and I think about things, I'm like, man, I'd rather not. I'd rather move towards something that I find more valuable than trying to fix something that I may not be able to find the solution to. So that's kind of been the nature of it. And so what does that leave me with? Well, I don't have any particular trauma that I hold as the linchpin of my addictions. And so again, we're all unique. It seems to be working pretty good for me. But in the midst of all those mental health scenarios that I found myself in, and all the years that I found I was in these clinics and things of that nature, I don't really know what exactly. I mean, I feel like it's a pretty easy diagnosis. I was depressed, bipolar, and things of that nature. It seemed as if I was that way. And looking back, I'm not mad at anybody for an inaccurate diagnosis. And for all I know, and it seems like you know a lot more about the mental health than I do, but at the time, it looked pretty clear. I suffered from all of those things. But as I had gained more clarity and worked harder on my character and my belief and adding value to the ones I love, and in choosing love every day, all of these different things, I ended up looking around and thinking, I don't need any more mental meds. I don't think that any of those diagnoses apply to me any longer. And so I've been very blessed to be able to say that.
So maybe if we're not thinking about it in terms of trauma, because trauma can be like a really big word, right? We think about traumas as being big catastrophes that happen to us. We think about traumas in terms of sexual abuse, accidents, natural disasters, those kinds of things. And so when we compare our lives to those and we don't have these huge call out moments, sometimes it can be really challenging to connect things. But do you feel like there was an underlying why behind your use? Not necessarily linking it back to some event that you went through, but was there some sort of need that you were trying to fill within your life? Or do you feel like it was, why turn to these substances? Was it boredom? Was it control? What was the reason?
Right. And so my answer for this is it's a little interesting. I think that a lot of really intelligent people become addicts. Why? It makes sense. You get the most results for basically the lowest cost in the short run here, obviously. In the short run, you get almost immediate relief from your problems. I was doing the math at first before everything really took a hold of me, and I felt stress, and a lot of people suffer from this kind of thought process. Well, I was stressed at work, so I'm going to go home and I'm going to drink a bottle of wine, or I'm going to drink 6 beers, or whatever it is. In the short run, you gain some relief, and that's how it begins. But then if you have what I consider an addictive personality, and I've thought about it a lot, I will always be an addict. And so I've decided that I have to stay addicted to really cool things. I have to stay addicted to valuable things. I have to stay addicted to things that excite me, that aren't selfish. And if I continue to do that, things seem to work out well. But if I choose selfishness, if I choose only me, then I could foresee going back to substances, because they make sense for a person who's like, okay, I have one evening to relieve myself of all of these problems. I don't really want to solve them long run, but at least I can get this one night out of the way. And then they go out and then they use and they drink, or they go out, they go to a bar, whatever it is. Maybe they overeat. And then for that evening, it probably works. It probably works. I mean, nothing really gets done. The real problems aren't solved in that evening. That's almost certain. But they go and they get it in the most selfish way possible. Again, I know that it's in my nature to be an addict. I will always be this way. So I choose being addicted to valuable things. And what I learned is that moderation, not really me. So I just continue to just run at stuff like a maniac. But if I'm running and choosing love and my son and my wife and my belief and creation of useful things, then like I said, it works out.
Wow, there's a lot to unpack with this. The first thing that I think would be interesting to talk about and just develop even more is the relationship between change and control. And interestingly, this is a topic that I've been writing about for the last couple of years, and a pattern that I've seen with all mental health and substance use challenges. We all encounter change in our life or stress in our life. Some will call it trauma. Trauma is another word for change. Sometimes it's big change, sometimes it's little change, sometimes it's chronic change over a long period of time. And humans have evolved to be able to control the change that they experience. So we were cave humans and we were cold. So in order to adapt to the cold, we created clothing and we found shelter. We controlled the weather. We controlled our warmth. When we were bored, we would go to the cave and we would paint on the cave walls. So now we controlled our boredom. When we were hungry, we learned how to hunt together in groups. And we also learned that we were safer in groups. So we controlled our safety and we controlled our hunger. We realized that chasing animals was like really time consuming and you had to travel all over the place. And so we learned how to domesticate these animals. And then we also wanted to not forage for food all the time. So we created farming. So we're constantly trying to adapt to change with an equal measure of control. Think about it in terms of other situations where we have control. We look up at the stars and we wonder, where did these stars come from? And we create stories to be able to tell our kids and to tell our friends so that we now control the cosmos, right? Now we have weather patterns, and when villages become too big and now I don't know everybody's name, we create rules to be able to all agree on so that we can control people when we don't see them, right? When we don't know everyone. There's a constant relationship between change and control. And something that you mentioned is, why would someone turn to alcohol in response to stress or to change in their life? Well, because it almost works. It almost works, right? It gives you temporary control over your emotions. And anybody who's feeling very stressed also feels out of control. And so we do all kinds of things that some are good for us, to your point, and some are not so good for us to control our circumstances. Whether it's what we eat or don't eat, or how much we eat, or how we work out, or the substances that we use, or the people that we hang out with. These are all measures that we use to try and control our life in response to the change and the stress that we have. So it's a very natural thing for someone to become addicted to substances because to your point, it's one of the few things that we can do to control our emotions. Even though it doesn't work forever, ends up hurting us in the end, it is a way that we can have some control in our lives. So who can blame somebody for turning to substances? But then you also brought up this really interesting point where you said, hey, I realized I'm an addict. I realized that addiction is a part of my personality, that when I do something hard, right? Like I go all in. And so I had to learn how to choose other things to control that would ultimately make me more happy than these other things. So maybe you could tell me more about these other things that you're doing when it comes to like, what are these other things that you're doing to control your happiness that you feel like you're going all into?
Well, first of all, this is a part of my steps here is developing belief in both a larger power than myself and then also inside of myself. So those two conjoined, I think, is something that I poured myself into. The belief in a power larger than myself was first. And then that started working for me. And the more I poured myself into that, it started to overflow into my life and into me personally, like my personal belief, my self-efficacy grew. I don't know if that specific order worked for me. However, what I can attest to is that both are important. The belief in something larger than yourself, it could be, the universe, it could be science, it could be Allah, it could be Jesus, it could be whatever the universe, whatever you desire to call it. It's thinking outside of yourself and you're realizing you're not necessarily at the center of it all. That can relinquish that selfishness that comes with addiction, and it can help with that. And then with the belief in yourself, with the development of that, the self-efficacy, it's also imperative. So the two working together is something that I've really poured myself into. So the question was, what am I pouring myself into? What am I addicted to these days? And I've developed a course to try to best organize these thoughts that sometimes seem a little like off kilter or seem kind of random. I've developed a new course, a new system. It's called Sober to Super. And so I've been really working and pouring myself into that. And the curiosity and just diving into it, man, it gives me a bucket to put all this energy into. Because I think what is a major blunder is for anyone that has an addictive personality or addictive nature, is to think that energy will just dissipate or disappear. It most likely won't. You're not gonna, if you've got the kind of tenacity that I know that I have in me. Like this, for instance, let's consider like an addict. The ingenuity of a drug addict when they need their drugs, off the charts. It's unreal. Look at like meth addicts. They strip copper from construction sites and manage to turn it into drugs. Like, it's like, I'm like, wow, So I've taken that very ingenuity that was used for harm and destroying myself and selfishness. And now I'm turning into things that are valuable that I can pass along to people. And I can just perpetuate this like a positive spin, and turn it into so many great things. So once I got a taste of that, man, it's been just a nonstop pursuit, and I'm having a blast doing it. And I think that that's really what holds me together, and it keeps me so far away from going backwards. And so, yeah, I'm very blessed to be taking on all these different kinds of projects and just dumping that same energy, knowing it's not going anywhere, and just like giving it to things that are so much more important. And yeah, and it's been an adventure, man.
That's a beautiful way to put it. I love how you broke that down. The last thing I'll say before we talk about where people can go to learn more about you is, if you're wondering, okay, out of the variety of things that I can be doing, that I can be pouring my energy into, how do I determine the right ones? A key thing to think about is, if you kept doing this thing over time, would it make your life better or would it make your life worse? If you carried this over for years and years and years, would this make your life better? Would it make your life worse? Obviously, with addiction, we see how that only gets worse, right? If you continue to increase the amount of drinking that you do every time you encounter a stressful event or use or whatever to deal with your problems, over time, even if it's not bad now, over time, it is only going to make your life worse. On the flip side, if you take some other things that you can pour your time into, to creating things, to investing in relationships, to building up your skill set, to developing your mental awareness and your mental health and the way you regulate your emotions and your breath, compounding that time, adding time to those things only makes you, in your words, like from sober to super, only makes you a more powerful person walking around in this world, right? And so it's a beautiful way to illustrate your point of, how do I know what to pour myself into, especially when there's so much? So in your book, Man Up, Sober Up, you talk about there's 8 different steps. We got through like a couple. You warned me we wouldn't get through them all, and that's fair. So where can people go to learn more about you and all the awesome work that you're doing?
Right. So myrockbottomrecovery.com. I've got a 21-day free challenge there. It's a good starting place. It's a fun 21 days. Also, My Rock Bottom Recovery on Facebook. I've got a nice page going, huge following, or maybe not huge, but like for me, it's exciting to see all those people and having eyes on some really good content that I'm putting out there. And then ryanpenley.org is probably my preferred site for people to come see me on. And that's got my latest project, the Sober to Super course. And so, yeah, man, I'm just doing my very best to just put what I believe works and is valuable for other people. And I'm just putting it out there, man. That's the name of my game.
Absolutely. Listeners, watchers, you can find all of those links linked up in the description box and in the show notes for this video or podcast, wherever you're consuming this. Listen, y'all, this whole addiction thing, this whole substance use thing, it is challenging. But as Ryan shared with us, sobriety is much easier to reach when we're consistently taking small steps to set achievable goals for ourselves and add it up over time. These achievements create the foundation for a life that we can feel good about and feel proud about. We'll see you on the next episode. This episode of Treatable was edited by Daniel Lopez. The intro and explanatory sections of the episode were written by Alexandra Kruger. The theme song was created by Sebastian Gonzalez, and the cover art for this episode is created by Joel Daniel. If you got any value from this episode, it would personally mean the world to me if you would leave us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts. It helps to spread mental health awareness to more folks, and I read each and every comment that people leave. So tell us what you appreciate about the podcast, and you just might hear us feature it on the next episode. All of my love, and we'll see you on the next one.